Out the front door, down the short stretch of sidewalk, past the same 3 houses with their lights still off at that hour. This was how Rob started his mornings. The house had been quiet before he left it. Not in a way that stood out. Not anymore. Just in the way it had settled over time. Everything in place. Nothing waiting on him before he stepped out. The street dipped slightly before leveling out again, and just beyond that, where the pavement narrowed and the trees closed in, the path began. It wasn't anything special. A paved trail the town had put in years ago, running behind the neighborhoods and cutting through patches of woods before continuing on toward the next town over. People used it. Runners, cyclists, sometimes dog walkers later in the morning. But at that time, before the day had properly started, it was usually empty. Rob preferred it that way. The air still carried some of the cold from winter, though it had started to soften. You could see it in small ways, thin lines of green pushing through the ground near the edges of the path, a few early blooms that hadn't been there the week before. The kind of changes you only noticed if you were out there often enough. He was. It had become part of his day without really announcing itself. Something he did before work, before anything else had a chance to start. He didn't think much about it anymore, just got up, dressed, and went. Rob kept a steady rhythm as the path opened into its first long stretch. The trees thinned slightly there, enough that the sky showed through in uneven bands, the early light just beginning to come in behind him. He knew the turns, knew where the ground dipped slightly, where the pavement had cracked and been patched, where the path curved out of view before opening up again further on. It was the same walk he'd taken the day before, and the one before that. He followed the path without thinking about it, letting it carry him forward the way it always did. By the time he reached the first bend in the trail, the light had started to come in behind him, thin at first, stretching through the trees in uneven lines that didn't quite reach the ground yet. He followed the curve without slowing, his pace steady, the same as it always was. The air felt a little different once he moved deeper into the trees. Cooler, quieter, the houses behind him already beginning to fall away. It was somewhere past the first turn that he had noticed the person ahead of him. Far enough that he hadn't registered them right away. Just the shape at first. Part of the path more than anything else. Someone walking in the same direction, keeping a rhythm that didn't stand out. That wasn't unusual. He saw people on the trail often enough, especially once the weather started to turn. It was the time of day that made it less common, but not impossible. Every so often there'd be someone else out early, moving through the same routine. There was a moment, brief, and not something he would have been able to explain later, where it felt like the person ahead had noticed him. Not turning, not stopping. Just something in the way their movement held for a second, as if it had adjusted slightly before continuing on. He didn't think much of it. It was easy to misread things like that when the light was lowered and the distance was stretched out between you. He let it go almost as quickly as it had occurred to him, settling back into a rhythm of the walk, the sound of his steps falling into place against the quiet of the trail. The person ahead remained where they were. He saw them again the next morning. Not in the same place exactly, but close enough that it didn't stand out at first. The path curved a little differently there. The tree set back just enough to open the space, but the shape of it, the spacing, the distance, felt familiar before he had time to think about why. He tried to get a clearer look this time. Dark clothes, maybe, or just the way the light fell through the trees. He couldn't make out much, not a face, not an age, only the shape of someone walking, and the sense that nothing about them had changed. He let that sit for a moment. People use the trail at different times. Someone starting earlier, walking longer, moving at a different rhythm. There are plenty of ways it could line up that way. He settled back into his usual pace and let the distance sit where it was. It didn't change. He noticed it more clearly that morning, not because anything about the figure had changed, but because nothing had. The same pace, the same posture, the same space between them, held without effort. There were places along the trail where it narrowed slightly, where the ground dipped just enough that your stride adjusted without you thinking about it. He moved through those sections the way he always did. The person ahead moved through them the same way. Not reacting to him, not acknowledging him, just continuing. It stayed with him a little longer that day. Not in a way that interrupted anything. He still went to work, still moved through the same routines, still returned home at the same time. Nothing about the day itself changed. But the thought came back to him more than once, always in quiet moments where there wasn't anything else competing for his attention. He didn't do anything with it. There wasn't anything to do. By the next morning, he wasn't expecting to see them again. But there they were, already ahead of him. Not in a way he could measure, just close enough that it felt the same as before. The same stretch of path, the same distance between them. It was just close enough that he didn't question it. He adjusted his stride slightly without meaning to. Not enough to draw attention to it, just a longer stride, a little more intention behind it. The kind of change that usually closes a gap over time. It didn't. The distance held where it was, as if it already accounted for the change. He let his pace settle again. The space between them remained fixed. That was the first time it felt deliberate. Not because he believed it was, not in a way he could explain. Just in the way something settles into place when it stops feeling coincidental. Later that morning, while standing in his kitchen, it came back to him again. He had already finished what he needed to do. Coffee poured, the same place by the counter where he always stood before leaving. The room was quiet, unchanged. Everything where it had been the day before. He stood there longer than he needed to, not thinking about anything in particular, just not moving on yet. The distance crossed his mind again. Not the person, not who they might have been, just the space between them, the way it held, the way it hadn't shifted, not once, without him noticing. He pushed the thought aside. There wasn't anything to it. He told himself there didn't need to be. The following morning, he was out a little earlier than usual. Not by much, enough that the street was quieter, the houses still, the trail empty in the way it usually wasn't by the time he reached it. He followed the same route without thinking about the change. He wasn't sure if he was expecting to see anyone, but there they were, already ahead, same distance, same pace, as if it had always been there, just out of sight until the path allowed them to be seen again. He didn't change his pace this time. He didn't test it. He just walked, and watched without meaning to. By then he had started noticing the turns. He noticed it more clearly the next time the path curved. It was a section he knew well, one of the longer bends where the trees thickened on one side and the trail slipped briefly out of view before opening up again. It wasn't a sharp turn, but it was enough that you lost sight of anything ahead of you for a few seconds as you moved through it. He walked it enough times to know roughly how long the stretch lasted. Long enough to close some distance if you were moving faster than whoever was in front of you. That thought stayed with him as he approached it. Not something he acted on right away. Just something that settled in the back of his mind, the way certain details do once you've noticed them more than once. The person ahead moved toward the bend without changing pace. He followed. His stride lengthened as he got closer. Not a sudden shift, nothing obvious, just a small adjustment. The kind that builds over time without drawing attention to itself. The person disappeared around the turn. He moved through a little quicker than usual. The trees closed in, the path narrowing just enough to focus his attention forward. For a moment, there was nothing ahead of him but empty stretch of pavement and the curve carrying him through. He kept moving, not rushing, just not holding back. By the time the trail opened again, he should have been closer. He knew that without needing to measure it. It was something you could feel, the way distance changes when pace does. There they were, same distance, same pace, as if the turn hadn't interrupted anything at all. He slowed without meaning to. The space between them didn't change. He noticed it then, the way it held. As if it had decided where it should be, and left it there. He shortened his stride slightly and settled back into his usual rhythm. The space between them didn't change. He kept walking. He thought about calling out, just to hear something answer back. but the thought didn't stay with him long enough to become words. The trail continued the way it always did. Straight stretches, then another bend, then open again. The same pattern repeating. The same points where the view ahead were cut off and returned. He noticed it each time now. Not actively tracking it. Not focusing on a way that could have made it more obvious to anyone else. Just aware. Every time the path shifted. Every time the person ahead disappeared from view. Even for a second. It didn't matter. They were always there again. Same pace, same distance. The thought crossed his mind again briefly to call out. Not loudly. Just enough to break the space between them. Something simple. Something that would have made sense if there had been any reason to acknowledge it. He didn't. He let the thought pass and kept walking, his pace settling back into what it had always been. Ahead of him, the person did the same. Rob continued to think about the distance. It stuck with him after that. Not in a way that changed anything about the day itself. He still went to work, still moved through the same routine, still came home at the same time and stood in the same places he always had. Nothing about that felt any different. But the distance, it stayed with him. The way it held. Not constantly. Not in a way that pulled attention away from what he was doing. It just returned, quietly, at points where there wasn't anything else to fill the space. He found himself thinking about the turns, about how long they lasted, how much distance they should have allowed him to close. It wasn't something he could measure exactly, but it was enough to know what he was seeing didn't match what should have been happening. He didn't try to explain it. There wasn't a version of it that made sense, and he didn't have any interest in forcing one. The next morning, he left at the same earlier time. The street was still. No movement from the houses, no sound carrying from anywhere nearby. It felt more contained at that hour, like everything outside of it hadn't started yet. He reached the trail and stepped onto it without slowing. The path stretched out ahead of him, empty. He kept walking. For a while, there was nothing. Just the sound of his steps, steady and even, the same rhythms he had fallen into without thinking about it. The trail moved through the same familiar pattern. Straight, then bending slightly, then opening again. He didn't see anyone. Not at first. It was only after the path curved again, after the trees closed in and opened back up, that the space ahead of him wasn't empty anymore. The person was there, already ahead, same distance, same pace, as if they had always been there, just out of sight until the path allowed them to be seen again. Rob slowed this time. Not much, just enough that the change was noticeable to him, if not to anything else. The distance didn't change. He stopped. It wasn't a decision, just something that happened. His body coming to a rest in the middle of the path without any real thought behind it. The person ahead continued walking. The space between them held for a second longer, then began to stretch. Not quickly, not in a way that drew attention to itself, just gradually. The figure moving further along the path as he stood where he was. He watched them go. Watched the distance increase in a way it hadn't before. It felt different. Not wrong, not exactly. Just different. He stood there a moment longer, then started walking again. His rhythm settled back into what it had always been. The distance stopped growing. It held. Exactly where it was. He didn't look behind him. There wasn't a reason to. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on the person ahead, on the steady movement, on the space that stayed exactly where it had always been. And he continued to walk. He became aware of it before he saw anything. Not in a way he could point to, and not because anything around him had changed in any obvious sense. There was no sound behind him, no shift in the air, nothing that would have made him stop if he hadn't already been paying attention. It was just there suddenly, the sense of something occupying the space behind him in the same quiet way everything else on the path had begun to feel fixed in place. He kept walking. The person ahead of him stayed where they were, moving at the same steady rhythm, the distance between them unchanged. But something about it had shifted, Not in front of him, but in the way his attention worked. It wasn't fixed forward anymore. It had split without him meaning to, part of it still tracking the figure ahead, part of it accounting for something he hadn't needed to think about before. He slowed slightly, not enough to draw attention to it, just small adjustment in his stride. The figure ahead slowed as well. Not immediately, and not in the way that matched him exactly, but close enough that it had settled into place the same way everything else had. He adjusted, shortening his steps a little more this time. The change settled but deliberate enough that he noticed it himself. The person ahead responded in the same uneven way. Again, not exact, not precise, but close enough that it stayed with him. He didn't test it any further. There wasn't anything to prove. The path curved again up ahead, one of the longer bends where the trees closed in and the trail slipped briefly out of view before opening back up. He knew it well, knew how long that stretch lasted, knew what it should allow him to do if the distance between them behaved the way it was supposed to. The person disappeared around the turn. He followed them, the same rhythm, moving through the curve without rushing, without slowing, the same way he always had. For a moment, there was nothing in front of him, just the empty path and the sound of his steps. Then the trail opened again. The person was there, the same distance ahead, unchanged, as if the turn had done nothing at all. He stopped. This time he didn't start walking again right away. He stayed where he was, the path stretching out in front of him, the figure ahead continuing without interruption. The space between them began to widen. Slowly at first, then more noticeably, the distance no longer holding the way it had before. He watched it happen without reacting. After a moment, he began walking again. His stride settled back into what it had always been. The distance closed, set back into place. Ahead of him, the figure remained where it had settled. He kept his eyes forward and kept walking. And after a while, it felt less like distance and more like something being kept.